Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 748th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the immense pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Dorothy Wang, Alain deSouza, and Joan Kee. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Margaret Rhee here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's incredible guests and host. Dorothy Wang is Professor of American Studies at Williams College, where she spearheaded the founding of Asian American Studies. Her monograph, Thinking Its Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, won the Association for Asian American Studies Award for Best Book of Literary Criticism in 2016. The only national conference on race and creative writing is named after it. Wang conceived of and co-founded the Race and Poetry and Poetics in the UK initiative. She has been an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellow. Alain deSouza is an artist working across photo, media, installation, text, and performance. They draw upon official and informal archives, remaking them through strategies of humor, fabulation, and mistranslation. deSouza has exhibited extensively in the US and internationally. deSouza is a professor of art practice at University of California, Berkeley, and has published numerous essays and two recent books, How Art Can Be Thought, A Handbook for Change, and Arc of Martyrs. Professor Joan Kee teaches history of art at the University of Michigan and is a Ford Foundation Scholar in Residence at MoMA. Her forthcoming book, The Geometries of Afro-Asia, Art Beyond Solidarity, engages with Black and Asian artists and the vibrant worlds they initiate through their works and will be released by the University of California Press this April. An occasional public interest lawyer in Detroit, she is an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail. We're so immensely grateful to have these three amazing guests here today, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to Joan.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for, first of all, for coming. Today is also kind of a moment in which to think about, so what are some of the more urgent questions or topics that we might need to think about together when thinking about the idea of an Asian American art? I became acquainted with Dorothy's work, again, through her very strong interest in form. And actually, I don't think there are enough words to explain how I came to know and love and admire the work of Alain deSouza, someone that whose work I have followed for many years since I was an undergraduate. But I wanted to invite both Dorothy and Alain to talk very briefly about some of the projects that they're currently working on, and then we can open up for a little bit of discussion. I think, Alain, would you like to go first?
Great. Thank you, Joan, and thanks, Eleanor and Brooklyn Rail for bringing this together. So I'm going to go straight into a work and really a focus on language, and with a nod to Dorothy's work as well. So the redaction series from 2010, and I'm going to show you a detail. And so they're taken from paintings from Gauguin and Rousseau. Here, for example, is Rousseau's fight between a tiger and a buffalo. And then the next image you'll see where I've redacted it and removed or overlaid each of Rousseau's colors with a color from the furthest point in the painting. And so it's bringing the most distant to the foreground, to essentially a kind of monochrome, but leaving the edges intact so you can still read it. And then I used that image for the cover of my 2018 book, which was engaged in a kind of similar process of rethinking the language we use to talk about art, especially the sort of inheritance from modernism, and how we need to adapt our language for, the world as it is, and for current events, and also for a global audience, to actually bring in languages from different perspectives. Okay, and then language again is really a focus for this book, Arc of Martyrs, and I've rewritten, and I think of it as a replacement of Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel Heart of Darkness, and you'll see in the next image that so inside the book, on the left side is Conrad's text, and on the right side is my rewritten text. And so I've replaced every word of Conrad's with a word that rhymes with it. And if we go to the next one, I'll just read. So actually, if you, everyone here, if you could read on the left side to yourselves, while I read just a few sentences from the right-hand side. So I'm going to start with That Nasty, and you can read with At Last We. Okay. So That Nasty, vote and impeach. Employee with a beard sounds concerned. Answered cried for war. Spouses ponder pill. Mothers are scion-proofed. The rumps unchaste administrations protracting furor affinity. Ignominious boys conjure masses amok, trumpet voters dicking for a bankrupted aberration. A mob, illegal, mostly cracker hatred, lubed with downright angst, already rejected its future bitter. Okay, so, mine makes sense as narrative in its own right, but, hopefully you were able to read alongside with Conrad's text. Okay, so let's go to the next one. And this is just a few installation shots of my most recent show, which was at the Johnson Museum in Ithaca at Cornell. And I'm going to show, well, there's a couple of installation images just to give you a sense of the work. And then I'll look at some individual works. And so these are paired with quotes from Dorothy's book, and I'll read the quotes. For immigrants and exiles, of course, this fragmentation is not merely literal and symbolic, but also concrete and material. If we go to the next one. So these are images of my father's apartment. They're paintings. I call them renderings. And they're based on photographs of his apartment after he died. So Dorothy's quote again, metaphor structure always reaching toward but never arriving, also mirrors the structure of memory. Okay, next one. Metaphor, like memory, is a means by which a poet tries to reassemble the flotsam of a lived life into some sort of recognizable intelligibility. And the series is called Flotsam. The chaotic existence of the refugee and exile is represented by broken things, the flotsam and jetsam of a destabilized existence. So, in using Dorothy's quotes, I really wanted to focus on these images as a kind of diasporic language, and the role of hyperrealism, kind of in relation to hypervisibility, when we think of the racialization of those terms of invisibility and hypervisibility, and what hyperrealism might mean in relation to memory. And of course, we don't remember this way. Okay, and again, quoting from Dorothy, poetry becomes the space in which the various parts are reassembled in an effort to ward off the threat of dissolution, a remembering of what was dismembered, the family, memory, homes, possessions. And this is a list compiled by my parents, 20 years previously, before they went on a trip. Okay, so this is one from a series of 12 grids from Elegy for Futures Present. It is worth remarking also that metaphor tends to deal in parts or single items. And this image is from, I photographed the same location every day for a year, and beginning from after my father died for a year after. So a kind of performance really of revisiting a place that becomes a place of memory, but literally a place of reflection. It's the reflection of a tree in water. And there's some details from that series. Poetry enables the immigrant, exilic, Asian American poet to recoup in language some of the losses ensuing from a life of wandering and to resist memory's erosions. And the next one. Like memory, to whose structure it is homologous, memory pulls together disparate fragments as a means of penetrating to the unknowable, the unreachable. Metaphor approaches the unfamiliar by means of the known, the strange via the familiar. Memory approaches the once familiar by means of the now known in its fragmented, cobbled together manifestations, the strange via the familiar. So, my use of language is often using a pre-existing text, but also, trying to think through relationships between, about representation between abstraction as a language and between, these examples of photorealism as a kind of different form of language. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I'm just so touched. I'm actually moved, just almost to being speechless by your use of the quotes from my book, and which I wrote quite a few years ago, actually. And actually, at this present moment, some of you know, well, Joan and some of the people here know, my house just got flooded where I live. So this idea of flotsam and jetsam is particularly relevant to me right now. And then, but yes, and I also, just before I start, I just want to thank Chloe and Eleanor at the Brooklyn Rail and Joan for putting this together, of course, Ellen, and then Margaret, who's going to read afterwards. So thank you, everyone. So this is my book, which I published in the end of 2013, and I'm working on some new stuff. And I thought what I would do is read a few paragraphs from a recent talk that I'd written that's actually very related to the topic we're talking about today, but I will just read a little bit and then speak a little bit more informally. So I'm not an artist or an art historian. I'm sort of the weirdo on the panel today. But I do think that in both Ellen's and Joan's work, there's a lot of overlap just with what I'm interested in because of just lots of questions about aesthetics, and especially Asian American and minority aesthetics, and questions about that link to race and colonialism that really overlap, as we can tell from Ellen's presentation, that things fit quite nicely between, with my book was on poetry and his visual art. So I'm going to read just a little bit and then I'll say a few things and I'll pass it on to Joan, because I know we want to have more conversation and open it up to Q&A as well. So so one of the things I've been thinking about recently is more, so my book was on Asian American poetry and I'm still interested in that, but I'm also interested in sort of foundational questions of aesthetics and questions about actually sort of what are seen as neutral or objective categories within aesthetics, and that straddles both poetry and visual art. So I'll just read a little bit of this. So I want to say English language poems. Sorry, I think I was in the wrong place. English poetry has long had a prestige and stature in the Anglo-American world and globally. Poems, because they are viewed as being disconnected to the quote unquote real world, having very little effect on material realities, are also excellent test cases for thinking about how ideology can be carried by objects that seemingly have no relation to larger questions of imperialism, colonialism, militarism, global capitalism, violence, etc. Indeed, I will argue that poems are in fact subversive and covert ideological messengers. And I'm going to refrain from using the virus metaphor. They're subversive and covert ideological messengers that enter readers' minds and hearts and profoundly affect the way we think of ourselves, our relationships, emotions, significant life moments, among other elements of our lives. But whereas novels and other narrative forms have long been acknowledged as being imbricated with the social world, think of Edward Said's seminal work on British novels and Orientalism and cultural imperialism, poems are more often seen as decorative and/or personal, private matters to be read in one's leisure hours or to be avoided because seen as too difficult. Yet consider how our views of even our most intensely private and fervently felt emotions, such as love, or views of ourselves, are deeply influenced by not only poems, such as Shakespeare's sonnets and Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, but by their more popular analogs, songs. After all, Bob Dylan did win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016. And it is important to note that the influence of English poetry and poetics is felt not only in the UK and its major former settler colonies, such as the United States, Canada, and Australia, but in other formerly colonized spaces and beyond: Ghana, Nigeria, Hong Kong, Kenya, St. Lucia, South Africa, Belize, Singapore, Palestine, India, Jamaica, Malaysia, the Bahamas, the Philippines, to name a few. When I visited Palestinian universities on the West Bank in May of 2016, I was surprised to find that the English literature professors were teaching from the Norton Anthologies of English Literature, T.S. Eliot and others, and not supplementing the material with writings by any BIPOC writers. So I have a little paragraph here about my own personal history, but I'm actually going to skip that. I can bring it up later, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about it. I basically say that my parents, who had gone to school in both China and Japan, had been steeped in English language and English literature. But when they got scholarships to come to college in the United States, they were missionary scholarships. They were never told about Jim Crow in the South. They both went to college in North Carolina. So my question was, what does it mean to have Shakespeare and Dickens feel the head of a Chinese teen in post-war China while the communist revolution was going on, but not basic and irrefutable facts about American society? These anecdotes, the ones I skipped, tell us what we already know, that the reach of English poetry is far, even in non-English speaking countries. It also demonstrates that the racial positioning of Asian Americans cannot be thought of in this country or globally in the absence of Black Americans and the Black experience. English language poems, I want to underscore, are not simply decorative accessories to the more violent aspects of British colonialism, but perhaps the most effective means of white supremacist indoctrination and colonial brainwashing. Certainly as effective as missionary proselytizing and more long-lasting in its effects. And I say that as someone who deeply loves English literature and whose great-grandmother was converted to Christianity at the end of the 19th century. The poetry of Shakespeare was used as an active cudgel by the British as they colonized and subjugated various non-white populations around the globe. The existence of such a quote-unquote transcendent, quote-unquote timeless bard was proof of the inherent racial superiority and inherent civilized nature, again in quotes, of the English in England. The rationale was not only that a superior white Anglo-Saxon peoples had produced arguably the greatest poet of the Western world, and thus the world, but that the genius of Shakespeare's poetry itself proved the biological superiority of the English as a race. So actually, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to read, and we can have more discussion. But so basically what I'm really interested in now is thinking very foundationally about sort of basic concepts that seem very neutral, as I said, don't seem to be directly related to colonialism, violence, war, genocide, but that are actually saturated with this, with just assumptions, the production of these ideas, and also the reception of them. So one of the things I would probably toss out is about Asian American aesthetics and thinking about Asian American literary and art criticism as ways in which that could be more ambitious, perhaps. I mean, not to denigrate anyone's work, but that we can actually maybe risk thinking really broadly and perhaps stepping on people's toes a bit. And I guess I would argue, I guess a question I would say, a sort of devil's advocate question I would maybe throw out is to say, are we a little too model minority in our criticism? Because obviously for me, it goes beyond just representation, though I think representation is very important. And I thought it was very important when I wrote my first book to give visibility to Asian American poets and writers. But I think that what I'm interested in now, and it's not an either or, is to think very foundationally about basic concepts of aesthetics and the imbrication with questions of race and colonialism. So I'll turn it over to Joan.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll also try to be as brief as possible. So I just finished a book on called Geometries of Afro-Asia that takes its cue from the famous Bandung Conference of 1955, but also thinks about longer histories of exchange or communication or interaction between, say, Asians and Blacks or Africa and Asia. And the key premise is the idea of a global majority. So the idea that, well, not the idea, the fact that 87% of the world are either Asian or Black. And here it's where solidarity is not the end goal, but rather to think about different kinds of relationships, which is why geometry comes in. One of the thinkers I was thinking about was the Belizean American mathematician Arlie Petters, who opens a chapter on global geometry. And he says, geometry is to open my mind so that I may see what has always been behind the illusions that time and space construct. So here, Afro-Asia is really about trying to urge a shift in values. What are we going to prioritize? What are we going to consider necessary versus optional? Okay. For the next slide, so one of the chapters looks at the friendship between Ron Miyashiro and Melvin Edwards. Mel is, of course, having an upcoming show in March, but I was also very struck by the extent to which Black artists are almost never seen in thinking about how they might engage with the world outside of either the Black diaspora, Africa, or Afro-America, despite the very, very long history of Black artists engaging very seriously with Asian cultural traditions or Asian histories. And so when thinking about friendship, I'm thinking about corroboration. How is it that artworks entwine with one another so as to become inseparable? The next slide, please. So another question to think about in relation to the idea of a global majority, which is a term that was in fact, has been used in various disciplines since at least the late 1960s. So one iteration is the third world. And in the United States, the first artist to actively take the third world and expand it into exhibition form was Carlos Villa, Filipino-American, who was very much invested in the idea of a commons as opposed to, say, single authorship. So here, pushing back against the property mindset and rather thinking about how is it that we all have an obligation to work with the inheritances that we all are confronted by. The next slide. So this is not artists that I discuss in my book, but I'm bringing up Patrick Nagatani here. One is because, again, the representation question that Dorothy, you set forth, again, I think it still resonates when thinking about Asian American art beyond, say, the East and West coasts. So Nagatani is based in New Mexico, and one of his flashpoints was thinking about color healing. So it's a form of art therapy that also gained momentum in the mid-1970s. And this is an idea that he brought into his works and his collaborations with Black artists and associates. The next slide, please. And again, thinking about, say, how is it that we can push back against model minority approaches to thinking about representation or form or presence. So one example might be Manuel Ocampo. So Ocampo was based in LA, but he is among a generation of artists who repatriated or moved back to Asia. So this is also something that might be thought about, is when we think about Asian American art, that we also think about, say, questions of repatriation or expatriation. And here is a map of LA consisting entirely of racial slurs. So this is taking the format of a road atlas, which was very common in the late 1980s, and fleshing it out so that this is actually what urban space looks, but also sounds like to the global majority. So the majority of those who do not own property, or for whom subsistence is a daily fact of life, or the 90% of the world for whom autonomy is a luxury and not a birthright. Next slide, please. Now, in also thinking about Asian Americans in the world more broadly, I just wanted to briefly bring up Mel Chin's work. And here is a work that is modeled after the masengo. So it's an Ethiopian musical instrument that kind of looks like a fiddle. And this was made during a moment at which the domination of Africa by the world of international aid, so whether from the Soviet Union, as the form that you see here alludes to, or by the so-called International Red Cross, that this is also, say, a relationship that has a very close interconnection with what we might think of Asian American art. Next slide, please. I did also want to just briefly mention abstraction, maybe something that we can talk about in discussion. So this is a work by Li Lan. Li Lan is Yunji's daughter. So Yunji is sometimes called one of the core figures of how we might construct an Asian American art history. So Yunji is someone that was active in the early 20th century. But it's actually the abstract works made by his daughter that I think really merits some further consideration about how does she take the format of common documents that are used in work or in by bureaucrats and extracts a certain kind of abstraction that gets us to think about labor in a larger sense. Next slide, please. And thinking about, say, abstraction, one other sort of lens to think about is the onslaught of digital media. So the internet becomes demilitarized, it becomes widely available for civilian use in the mid-1990s. And I was thinking that this is one way to think about Byron Kim and Glenn Ligon's collaboration, Black and White of 1993, which surprisingly doesn't really get talked about. So what this is another sort of aspect to think about too, is when we think about Asian America, that it is impossible to disconnect it from a comparative racial approach. That, for example, it will never been valid to think about Asian American art without thinking about artists, especially Black artists. So this is also another question we might want to think about. Next slide, please. Now, here we have another collaboration, and this is an installation view of Heng Nuo and Heng Anzheng's work. I especially like the title. And again, Dorothy, when you were talking about poetry, and Alan, I know that you yourself are very attuned to language. In fact, I read your book, How Art Can Be Thought, as a call to rethink some of the terms that are taken for granted. And so this is a title that I just thought was very interesting, is the opposite of looking is not invisibility. The opposite of yellow is not gold. So one way to also think about this is to what extent is if there is such a thing as the Asian American subject, to what extent is it always seen in terms of, say, these kinds of oppositions or antagonisms or even or dyads? And I actually wanted to think about whether the opposite of looking is just to ignore, to just pretend as if it never existed. Next slide, please. So this is a work that the two artists, what they did was to pair photographs of their family members. In this case, the first is of their respective mothers. And then in the next, if you could go to the next slide, would pair them with reproduce texts of congressional testimony about what to do with all these Vietnamese people who are coming in because of the Vietnam War. And I chose to focus on this particular text because this is where two congressmen, so Joshua Elberg, who was a Republican from Pennsylvania, was trying to invoke the quote unquote Cuban situation to make the situation of Vietnamese refugees legible to his fellow Congress people. So this is also just another sort of question to think about in terms of, so what does a comparative racial approach look like when thinking about Asian American art? And to what extent, again, can we rethink the method of comparison, which is so fundamental to any kind of art history? Again, what is it that Asian America has to bring? So I just wanted to briefly leave it here and open it up for conversation and asking Alain and Dorothy, for you, again, given your extensive backgrounds and also your different backgrounds, so practice and again, theory and critical writing and poetry, what for you are some of the more urgent pressure points that arise when we think of, or maybe not think of, Asian American art?
Oh God. I mean, I think you've identified it, some of those things already. To not, while it has its specificities, like to not think of it without also thinking of it in relation to other racialized categories. Whether it's Black artists, when I was living in LA, for example, because I don't drive, I was riding the buses, and so there's already a kind of class and racial assumption of who uses public transit, and so people would only speak to me in Spanish, and so for those of us who are South Asian, what are those sort of wider discussions around, brownness within the US? And coming from Kenya through Britain and through the Black Arts movement in Britain, my relationships, politically and historically through Black Arts was alliances with African Caribbean artists, as well as those from Africa, regardless of ethnicity. So it's always been coalitional, because I don't see any other way of operating. In the same way that Asian American is already a sort of coalitional politics.
Yeah, I would say that I can speak just personally. I grew up in North Carolina, in Eastern North Carolina, and there were very few Asian American people there. So it was very Black, white, and very segregated, very Jim Crow. And, people go different directions when they grow up in that environment as an Asian American. But for me, it really radicalized me because I saw the racialized treatment, obviously mistreatment of Black people, but just the hypocrisy and all sorts of things. So for me, my own identity and my own politics has never been separable from Black people, Black politics. And the writers that most influenced me are actually not Asian American writers, because I'm old enough, to be a person that sort of was being educated before Asian American studies really became a discipline. So the most significant writers in my life are Black writers. James Baldwin and Miri Baraka, I can go on. I mean, there's so many people that are so important to me. And but I think one of the tricky things that you do bring this up, Joan, about the idea of comparison. And I think that it's difficult for Asian Americans because often there is this comparative suffering model and the idea that somehow Asian Americans are the most privileged of minorities, or in this really offensive term, or they are honorary whites. And so I think it becomes difficult sometimes. I think Alain is right that it's coalitional. There's also just political solidarity and politics, but it does often become inevitable that people compare the experiences, and it becomes like, and I think I understand that. I don't think that's wrong. It's natural, but I do think sometimes it creates a sense that Asian Americans don't really have the right to talk about the racism they experience, for example, or so it's difficult. I think it's not always clear because I'm, I think one of the things that I would probably throw out for everyone is that I'm really impressed in terms of intellectual stuff and academic, just vitalism with what's happening in Black studies and Indigenous studies. So a theoretical movement like Afro-pessimism, even though I don't agree with everything that it concludes, I think there's just a vitality and a kind of risk-taking and a politics in it. And I sometimes wonder, well, you know, should Asian American studies have something like that? Or, I mean, maybe that's a wrong question, but so it would be nice to, I don't know, I guess I do want to know, like sometimes, you know, the simplistic version of Asian American identity is that it is just about identity and a solidarity based on identity. And that's a very simplistic mode, obviously. But when we talk about when we talk about politics and real racial solidarity, and it becomes difficult sometimes, because I actually find that the people I can speak to most about issues of race are actually usually friends who are Black and brown, you know. But not always, but I wonder about that. And I think comparison is always difficult, you know.
Yeah, you know, if I can add, yeah, I mean, I agree, you know, that comparison is sort of limited in you know, in its usefulness. But one of the things I wanted to add, and this is partly because my work is around landscape, as the looking at the land, so emphasizing that active looking. You know, we can't think of landscape in the Americas without considering, without indigeneity being actually the basis of that. And you know, what does it mean to be a settler, looking at the land here? And of course, all, you know, our inheritance of 19th century landscape painting and photography, you know, predominantly representing manifest destiny in some form or settlement in some form. And so for me, it's that question of how to undo that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I was actually talking to the artist Simon Leung, and he just threw out a really provocative statement that, can we re-theorize Asian American art as itself a theory of democracy? And I thought that was quite interesting, because again, if you think about how is it that democracy is really a constant battle to contend with all these multitude of differences, that you know, it kind of maps onto some of the interesting writing that's being produced on the concept of Africanity. So theory of how to contend with tribalism and pluralism while seeking to benefit from the unity that Africa affords. But this is perhaps one way in which, say, Asian American art offers the possibility of a different theory that then might also be useful in thinking about, well, what would a democracy actually look like, or how might that actually come to pass? So that was one question. And I guess another question for both of you, because both of you are so very concerned and invested with form. And, you know, one of the things that's always been troubling is the extent to which, again, form and politics are often seen as mutually exclusive, that formalist in some circles is like a pejorative, which I personally find completely baffling and ahistorical. But I was wondering what both of you thought, again, of the role that form plays and the extent to which form generates its own set of politics.
Well,
yeah, you know, Dorothy, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Ellen. I'll go
okay. Yeah, no, I agree with Simon, you know, that it's a crucial question. I mean, it's a central question, because, you know, both, you know, so much of these histories of, you know, artistic categorization around race, around class, around gender, around representation. And visibility. And of course, that's the central premise of democracy as well, of being represented and having a representative who can represent oneself. But it, you know, democracy is also defined by its limits of who gets represented. And if Asian Americans are always seen to be Asian rather than American, they're always placed outside of that notion of the citizen, you know, if they're the perpetual foreigner, the perpetual alien. And so in some ways, Asian Americans do mark the edges or the boundaries of democracy. And so our questions of representation within the visual languages we use, I think, are exactly this question of democracy.
And I was just thinking back to different moments in US history, and we think about, often the argument is that, well, chattel slavery, Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, those are just kind of exceptions. They were just unfortunate events, but we're moving forward, and we have this idea of equality and progress. But actually, if you think about it from the beginning of our republic, or even before, these exclusions, and I would say these genocides and these torturing of other people, is actually fundamental, for the allowance of a kind of freedom and democracy for certain groups of people. So it's really on the backs of other people that you then have this notion of freedom and democracy. So I think back, and this is something I wrote about in my talk as well, that Thomas Jefferson, who was a poet as well as many other things, talks about why Phyllis Wheatley, a Black woman poet, the second published person in the Republic, was constitutively unable to really write poetry because she's Black, because of her biology, right? So this is like, okay, Thomas Jefferson, whatever, but he's really foundational for so many things, of ideas of political rights and also of the humanities. So it's really, I think democracy itself is fraught, right? And I also think, to go back to your question about form, Joan, that just to give a more concrete example of what I was speaking about earlier, about sort of fundamental basic ideas that seem neutral. So I would use something like the idea of tone in a poem, but there could be tone in a painting, right? Tone in a artwork. And of course, you were showing those skin tones in the Ligon and Kim work. But for example, what tone does a poetic speaker strike in a poem? And an Asian American writer, especially a female Asian American writer, there's an expectation of a certain kind of tone, right? And there's an excellent poem by the contemporary Asian American poet Prageeta Sharma called Grateful. And it's all about having to be grateful. And I actually think that for many writers, Asian American writers, they have to strike a kind of conciliatory diplomatic tone with the presumed reader or critic, who is usually a white critic or a white reader, right? So it is a kind of taking on of a voice that is sort of as one would do in a kind of missionary relationship to a benefactor or something, right? So I think one has to think about tone. Just seems like, oh, it's personal, it's just particular to an individual person, but it really isn't, right? And I could say that for other categories like description, or, and I wrote in my book about metaphor, of course, irony and all these other things, but many of these very basic concepts about poetry are deeply saturated with, of course, class and gender issues as well, but certainly race and colonialism, racial and colonialist ideas.
One of the questions too is, there's been such a recent groundswell of interest in Asian American art, especially from, say, an institutional and also commercial, sector. Part of that being propelled also by, get younger Asian American dealers, which did not happen until quite recently. I mean, there had been something of a market for Asian American art, but not to this extent. And we now have Asian American trustees on major museums. So one question for both of you is, I guess, maybe you can also open up to the audience about the role of the market in stimulating interest in Asian American art. But is there, say, something you wish, just to follow up on Dorothy and Alan, both your points about how is it that we can be less risk averse, right, in our thinking? You mentioned, I think, Dorothy, you mentioned Afro-pessimism. For me, I find Frank Wilderson deeply, deeply problematic. But having said that, his statement, I don't give a rat's ass about solidarity, has, for me, been extremely valuable. So one of the questions I had for both of you is, what would you like to see more of, or maybe less of, maybe?
Well, I just actually would like people to take more risks. Everyone's so careful. It's so boring. I find it really boring, like really reading a lot of criticism. And it's like, okay, yeah, and I'm being provocative here. Of course, there's a lot of good criticism, but I would like people to take more risks and actually stick their necks out more to talk about issues. I mean, there's so many pressing issues now for Asian Americans, right? Like we had this like ongoing pandemic violence, you know, it's like it's not just that. And this is also troubling that the only time Asian Americans have visibility is when they're being murdered and attacked, you know? I mean, but, you know, I saw that in Texas, they're thinking about passing a law to forbid Chinese people from China, but I don't know if it's all Chinese people, from owning land now. So we're just going back, you know, these cycles of US history. So, and yeah, the market, I mean, you guys could speak better to that about art and stuff, but with the poetry market, there's still a poetry market. And I think also literature market. And I think a lot of minority writers, not just minority, all writers, but, you know, I know certain, I know of a particular Asian American writer who's highly successful, who said that he consciously wrote for the New Yorker, the white New Yorker reviewers, so he could get a literary prize. And it worked, actually. So that's always there, right? So who is the imagined reader? Who is the imagined critic? You know, I think that's always there.
Yeah, I guess the the market also, like, to what extent it requires artists or writers to perform their sort of Asianness, and also Asian American communities, especially in the sort of wake of different kinds of violence, might be also expecting that too. There's a kind of performance of visibility, so the work has to look Asian, whatever that means.
Actually, on that note, and I just realized Simon is with us. Simon, could I ask you to contribute just a little bit of, again, elaborate on what you meant by Asian American art offering the possibility of a theory of democracy, because I hear a lot of resonances between your statement and those of Dorothy and Alan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Simon.
Hi, Dorothy. Hi, Alan. What do I mean? I mean that Asian Americanness has just the category has a historical dimension to it. So I'm thinking about 1968, and I'm thinking about how it was always already a form of strategic essentialism, and it was always considered to be provisional. Just as I think one cannot disassociate Blackness from this deep, horrible history of chattel slavery, I think you cannot disassociate Asian Americanness from that moment on some level, which has a very specific context. But I'm also thinking about democracy as a proposition of what constitutes the making of public space, what becomes public. And so through the strategic essentialism of Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans gathering to say we are Asian American, what that does is to say that we have a right to public space, and this is, in a sense, a form of intimacy. And what I would propose is that we take responsibility for our intimacy, and that is, in some ways, the way in which democracy can work. In democracy, one has to be essentially open to the other. And also democracy, and I'm not thinking about representational democracy, in a sort of democratic, Republican sense. I'm thinking about it, perhaps along the lines of Claude Lefort, in thinking about how sovereignty is an open question. And therefore, I am thinking through that openness. And certainly in all of your work, in Dorothy's work, and Joan's work, and Alan's work, you are already thinking about that, right? You are already, in a sense, going beyond the comparing contrasts model, in a sense, reframing what does it mean to be open to the other? What does it mean to share in intimacy? Intimacy is neither good nor bad. but it is the structure through which something like an enunciation, can take place. So that's how I would open up by. That's how I would, start a conversation about what I mean when I say that the evocation of Asian American is always already a theory of democracy.
Dorothy, Alan, would you like to respond?
That's really useful to bring in, that whole question of intimacy, especially in relation to shared public space. And to think of artworks and poetry, of course, as intimate forms, because we address the body, we address desire and anxiety, and as forms of relationship. So I think the languages we use and the strategies we use for making work are exactly everything you said, Simon. That to me that. And in my book as well, how art can be thought. I talk about critique as a form of training for democracy. Learning to use language with across difference.
And since I look so much at language, I'm actually curious for those of you, because of those of you who work on art, because when you think about English language poetry, as Simon said, the figure of the Asian is always constitutively foreign, but also constitutively not a native speaker of English, right? And because English, the mastery of English is so tied to the notion of whether you're really an American, a true American, a real American. When you think about Asian Americans in relation to poetry and English language poetry, there's a way in which they are this like ultimate test case for how we think about the racialized poet or writer, and whether they belong to this canon or whether, and again, by analogy, whether they belong as citizens in this country, because as we know, with Chinese exclusion and all sorts of things, internment, but many other things besides that, all these laws that the notion of the citizen and the notion of who is American has always, of course, it's also in relation to Black people and Indigenous, but Asian and Asian Americans play a central role in those questions. So for me, the question of language, especially English, and the figure of the citizen or the human, sometimes, of course, for Afro-pessimism, it's the figure of the Black that's the non-human. But I think for Asians, they are often made into the non-human as the virus, as the insect, as the vermin, as the robot, right? So I think one has to think about all these things, and there's a lot to think about. Yeah.
So actually, Dorothy, would you say that in many ways that Asian American art is never outside translation, and it can't really be aligned to the source target model that the classical translation study says there's a source and there's a target, but more recent translation talks about how is it that one just first has to accept that there is nothing that is outside of, again, that everything is going to be a translation from one direction to another. And then the second, I was thinking about Simon and Alan, your provocations about how is it that we maybe shift from a rights-based model of Asian American art to one that prioritizes communal obligation, and that's very difficult to do, especially in contexts where individual achievement that's what, individual authorship or the individual artist, that is what is incentivized. So I'm wondering too, is how is it that for the kind of art that, or way of thinking about art that we want, cannot flourish given the current models of institutions that we have now? I don't know if that, if that makes sense, but yeah.
Well, maybe I'll address your first question, Joan, and then Simon and Alan can talk about. But I think in terms of that notion of translation, I remember when I first started doing Asian American poetry, people would say, "What do you work on?" I said, "Asian American poetry," and they would say, "Oh, you mean haiku, like Japanese haikus?" And I would say, no, in English, you know, like people writing in English here. And people just couldn't compute the fact that there could be Asian American poetry in English. They just always thought it was an Asian language poetry, which, you know, and so I wonder in art too, because I know less about this, but it seems to me that this difficulty of I mean, there's a whole history of Asian art. It's incredible, right? Like, and how Asian American artists are they always seen in relation to the Asian, because, you know, the medium of art, the various media of art is quite, in poetry, it's very specifically English language. I mean, or you use, you know, some Asian language, but it's really in this country, you're mainly writing in English. So I am curious about that notion of translation, but certainly even when you're writing fully in English, people are always thinking that you're actually writing in another language, or that your first language is an Asian language. And I've had quite a few educated people say to me, is English your first language? And I, you know, have a totally American accent, you know, and a PhD in English, and I grew up in North Carolina, but they just see you and they cannot make that jump that you actually can be a native English speaker. So, but I'm curious, because I think I'm not sure in this particular, with these questions, Joan, that art and poetry are exactly the same here, you know.
Yeah, but I do think of, I mean, all art already being a kind of forms of translation, you know, between the work and the viewer as a two-way process. But you know, I also think of European modernism as a kind of dominant language, where we as viewers have already become translated to access that language. And, you know, so to think of that language as a kind of colonial aesthetic pacification. And so that pacifying role that modernism plays is to translate audiences and viewers into that notion of the sort of universalist language. So, you know, I don't think Asian American art is distinct from that, of it having to play a role of translation. You know, think of all art already being a form of translation, and I do think of modernism also as a form of re-racialization. So, you know, if we think of the usual Gauguin, Picasso, Matisse, etc., incorporating, you know, formal visual languages from different parts of the globe and re-racializing them as European.
Well, actually, on that note, should we open it up to the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joan. And thank you so much, Dorothy and Alan. This has been an amazing, amazing conversation. So rich. And thank you so much, Simon, for jumping in as well. We do have a couple questions. And if any audience members think of a question or would like to ask anything, and feel free to raise your hand or throw it in the chat. And our first question today is going to be from Michael. You should be able to unmute, Michael.
Hi, everybody. Wonderful conversation. Thank you. And actually, Alan, you just kind of answered the question that I was going to ask, so I'm going to try to rephrase it. My feeling is, and you know, like I'm coming from a Jewish background, and I don't consider myself a Jewish artist, and in that I feel that if I identify as a Jewish artist, I inhibit my ability to transcend those parameters which were placed upon me as a definition of what that is. And I understand it's, I understand your points, and it is probably easier for me to kind of pass into the American culture easily because I can pass as white, you know, and in my business and everything else that I do. But I'm wondering is there an art? Is it possible that art can transcend all of these cultural differences? And my point is that maybe that by identifying with these cultural inferences, we inhibit our ability to transcend and really create something universal. Like, I'm this artist, I'm that artist, I'm this artist. We get stuck And is that stuckness a form of self-colonization, a self where, you know, we live in the society, so we think of the viewer, and when we think of the viewer as a specific thing, are we inhibiting our own ability to transcend whatever that idea of the viewer is? Are we creating the viewer as our own kind of like projection of what that's going to be, and how we have to fight against that? Sorry, a lot of questions. But it's a very interesting conversation, and it's making me think a lot about different things.
Actually, can I address that, because it's something I've thought about, the universal, because I actually think about the universal poetic speaker. So one of the things I've been thinking about, for example, was, you know, when I was going to school as a young person, Robert Frost was always the kind of iconic poem you would read, you know, his poetry in high school, The Road Not Taken, Stopping by Woods on Snowy Evening. And there's always presumed that it was sort of a universal humanistic message, timeless, you know, and actually, if you think about it, the idea of the universal is a false idea, really. And many, I mean, it's not just, I actually don't like the sort of like opposition of universal and particular, because if you think about the universal, so when you read a Frost poem, you're not thinking that this is a, you know, a cis straight, you know, cis male growing up in New England, went to Harvard, you know, lives in Vermont. But if you read a poem, say, by an Asian American woman like Marilyn Chin, none of my students would ever presume this was a universal poem, because usually what they do when they read a poem by, say, an Asian American woman poet is to actually presume the poetic speaker is the poet, and it's autobiographical, and they'll say Marilyn said this in the poem, and I'm like, wait, you've got to separate from the poetic speaker and the poet. And I think that idea of the universal and the transcendent is actually, if you sort of take it apart, is premised on a lot of gendered and raced assumptions. But it's not to say then that we trash poetry or we trash Robert Frost. I think people often want to create this opposition of then like, well, we have to throw out Shakespeare and only read like Ntozake Shange or something, right? No, I mean, I think there's nothing one loves. I mean, I always say that the deepest connection I had with my father was not Chinese culture, but Romantic poetry, because he was a professor of Romantic poetry, and it's John Keats and it's William Blake and it's William Wordsworth. But do I understand that the ways we think about those poets are deeply racialized? Yes, but it doesn't take away from the beauty and the emotion of them. I think it's not either or, and I think often this opposition is set up as an either or of universal or particular. Anyway, yeah, others could speak.
Yeah, no, you know, and I would really just reiterate that if you know, all those notions of inclusivity, like the universal and so on, are already racialized, you know, in service of white suprematism, you know, and I call it suprematism as an art movement. If they're already racialized, then, you know, one of the strategies we have is to, is as a counter-racialization, you know, and we can discuss how effective that is or not, but the terms have already been set.
You know, actually, you know, Michael, your question gets us to one of the key debates in actually Black African philosophy. So I'm actually thinking about, for me, there's a book called Cultural Universals and Particulars that's written by a philosopher named Kwasi Wiredu in 1997. And he actually tries to argue a case for the universal, saying that this is in some ways a means for which to, again, think about how robust is our own culture. So he's Akan, and he's talking about the universal as a way to think of his own culture as robust enough to withstand real pressure. And in that situation, be able to put pressure on the idea of a whole. But his I guess his nemesis was a South African anthropologist named Archie Mafeji, who says, well, why is it that alterity and critique are the only available courses if you are a non-hegemonic artist? And he's saying, why is it that if you are of a certain racial or cultural or ethnic or gender background, you're always put in the position of the one who reacts, the one who has to defend, the one who has to explain themselves to make the others feel comfortable, when in fact, wait, we're the global majority. No, this is, we shouldn't have to explain ourselves. So I think this is one of the questions that you're getting at too, is to think about how is it that the idea or the myth of the universal always persists, even as we say, oh, this is something that is, again, something that's been discredited. It still persists. It's still a dream or an aspiration. And I think having that kind of, or keeping the friction between the universal and the particular in mind is perhaps one of the ways in which we might want to think about form, and especially, say, abstract painting, for example.
Simon, can you a bit more about with your question, the anxiety of the modern?
Oh, okay. I want to say something about English, because Dorothy was provoking us to think about art and poetry. We know that English is, in a sense, too powerful to be left to the native speakers, right? And that is especially true, I think, in the art world, where there's a doubleness, I feel, that is palpable, because I think about this in my own work, and how I think about like, for example, I'm a native speaker of Cantonese, and Cantonese, let's say in the Chinese art context, the way that I think about it is that it squats under the national language of Putonghua or Mandarin. But every biennial everywhere in the world, whatever the local language is, it squats under English, right? And this has been one of the effects of globalization. I mean, even French intellectuals, would say to me, a book doesn't exist if it's not published in English, right? So I think that I feel that there's a real nuance in power relations when you go beyond national borders into how English functions. And of course, I'm not a native speaker of English, but I have facility in English, and I was educated in English. So I think that my relationship to language is seen to be by, let's say, Europeans or by Asians as having this access that they feel they cannot really have, right? So I think as an Asian American person, especially in Europe, I would say, the question of you being Asian or you being American is multi-layered. It's not really even a matter of belonging or not belonging. It has all of these layers of fantasies about money and access and facility, or if they were to project upon you Chineseness, let's say, there would be this fantasy of a great deal of cheap labor that is available to you, and so on and so on. So I think that the art world, or the many art worlds in which we live in, we have to, in a sense, negotiate language all the time. And I would say, in some ways, especially in relationship to the modern, right? So I'm particularly thinking about the artist David Diao, whom I knew, whom I know, but I met him in the 80s. And I think that he's somebody who, I think he's an amazing, amazing artist. And his not having the same level of critical or commercial reception as, quote unquote, his peers is both something that is within his, like he thinks about it within his work. He actually makes paintings about it. He made a painting, I believe, of his CV or something. But I think that and I don't know how old David is exactly, but maybe in his 70s, maybe even early 80s by now. But I think that an artist of a generation above mine, maybe he's 1 generation, 2 generations older than I am, that anxiety about being able to even access that which is thought to be universal, like geometric shapes, right? Like the circle, like the square, is such that you either have to never talk about anything contextual, including race, including immigration, including, the historical development that got us to Malevich. You either do that, or you, in a sense, acknowledge it, and then you are pigeonholed into this, position of ressentiment, right? So these are all impossible positions, but I think that I'm not theorizing anything. I'm merely describing that we exist in matrices, in contexts of, in aporias, in which even the very premise of something like the universal or the modern or translation, these, in a sense, are all coming to you all at once. Maybe that's one aspect of being Asian American that I'm really interested in thinking through. I don't know.
Actually, Simon, are you also talking about the different speeds at which, say, one becomes a recipient or becomes a transmitter, or say, a nexus? Because the other thing I've noticed is thinking about Asian American art, that one has to grapple with so many different senses of generation or time or history, that any one of us inhabits multiple histories to the point where it becomes a state of paralysis.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, all right. I think for me, I'm a teacher. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be teaching Tei-Shin Hsieh's work. And what I always do is I show Tei-Shin Hsieh's time clock piece, where his hair is growing and, the guy didn't sleep, for more than an hour for the entire year, right? And what I usually do is I ask my students, what is the time of this work? Now, I can do this with absolutely any work of art, but I think that this really renders very specific a particular, well, lack of a better word, poetry, of the Asian American experience, right? Because we're sitting there and it's 6 minutes of us looking at this guy, not sleeping for a year. The time is moving, but it's also what, 1980, around 1980, 1979, 1980. And I asked him, well, and I think this was the last piece that he made under the name Sam Hsieh, because he was an undocumented person, right? I mean, Tei-Shin Hsieh actually became a famous artist while he was undocumented in a public way. So I think that these multiple levels of time, these different orders of time that the work really brings out, allows me to ask the student, to entertain the proposition that every work of art has many, many different orders of time within it. And maybe the task, perhaps impossible task, but nonetheless, as a viewer of art, as somebody who's thinking about art, I try to get myself to think on the order of time of the work of art, however I imagine it to be. So I think it's really an ethical question of the time of day.
Yeah, no, so, you know, and I do similar exercises with my students. And I do think that also one of the way that racialization works, you know, especially in relation to Asian America, where Asia is, and the same with Africa, so often configured as a past. And so, you know, the work, rather, if Asia is the past, America is a present or a future, then, you know, artists' works are still only configured or thought of in relation to that past element. And so that's also one of the questions, critical questions of how to get the work to be seen in the present.
Yeah, thank
And-
you. Go
Oh,
ahead,
do we have
Dorothy,
time,
sorry.
Ellen? Oh, sorry. Do we have time, Ellen? Or just wondering about our time?
There are a couple more questions I'd love to
Okay.
get to,
Yeah.
but
So why
you
don't
can
we do
feel
that?
free to
I can
jump in.
refrain. No, you just go ahead with the questions because I'd rather hear the audience. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Chloe.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank you so much for this conversation. Ellen, I was really struck by what you said about all art being a form of translation. And I wonder how you think about mistranslation in that statement. And if there's a role of mistranslation as being somewhat a call and response to translation itself, and in constantly sort of perpetuating a reinvestigation of art and of language and of the way that we frame everything.
Yes, another question about everything. Yeah, I mean, you know, part of, you know, my thinking around translation is that we as viewers have also been translated.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, there is no going back to a kind of pre-translation of sort of fantasy of you know, purity, or, you know, authenticity. But yeah, so, you know, so my work, so much of my work is directed to how the viewer is actually engaging with the work, and the language we use for that engagement. You know, which is already a translation of you know, we undergo this process of looking or engaging with artwork, supposedly translating what it means for us, translating our own, you know, responses, whether, you know, bodily or emotional or intellectual, back into language. So, you know, engaging with artwork is already to engage with so many different forms of translation. And so my interest is how do we remake ourselves, you know, as viewers, as artists, understanding we as artists and viewers have been translated already, and therefore to engage with those languages. Okay, I'm sort of moving around your question, but don't really have a really succinct way of, you know, just because it's so complex, to how to answer that in an immediate way.
Could I jump in for a second? Because actually what I was going to say earlier is related to both what Ellen said, well, actually what Joan, Ellen, and Simon all said. There's the issue of translation in terms of, I think what Simon was saying about actual like material and structural power and wealth and like award shows and which artists get written about, which get invited to biennales, like which poets around the world in different languages get translated into English. And I think that's a very important question to think about, that there's really like, there are material consequences of visibility in the English speaking world, right? And there are a lot of power dynamics. So I think that's right. And to go back to what Alen was saying about modernism, it's still in poetry too, it has this incredible power. It's still the pinnacle, right? And the assumption is that, you know, and going back to what Joan said, like issues of abstraction or whatever, irony, they're seen as these free-floating, just neutral things. And they're really not, because the basis of modernist poetry is not only a taking from other cultures, but really bad, like fascistic, right-wing, racist eugenics politics. I mean, it's not an accident, right? I mean, like Pound and Stevens and Eliot, these are not, or even Stein, they're not sort of like, okay, they had some bad, or they were like of their time. They had really extreme views, right? That even for the time. So I think actually this, because one of the people here is John Keene, and John Keene has written a really excellent essay on how many of the translations that are done every year, there's so few done of African or Black or brown writers. Disproportionately, it is white writers that get translated, right? And I don't want to put John on the spot, but he's in the audience, and I don't know if he wants to add to that. But certainly this issue of who gets translated, who gets to win the Nobel Prize, right? So, and speaking of the Nobel Prize, that the winner of the Nobel Prize 2 years ago was Louise Glick, an American poet. A talented poet, you know, she's often seen as a universal poet. She's Jewish American. But in her Nobel speech, she begins by citing her love of the song Swanee as a child. So if you're going to talk about Swanee, which is a deeply racist minstrel song, and then you're speaking to a global audience, you're probably never going to have a bigger audience than that, right? One has to ask, well, what is going, you know, what is that about, right? A kind of deep personal love for Swanee, right? But what does that mean in terms of American poetics? So anyway.
Great question, Chloe. That was really awesome. Thank you. I would love to ask a question to close out the Q&A. I have two connected questions. I know, I'm sure this is going to be a big question, but Dorothy, I'm so curious to hear more on the co-founding of Asian American Studies. And kind of specifically the like place of the academy in this context and of the academic institution. And then kind of along those lines, I'm curious about overlap between Asian American studies and Native American studies and African American studies or Black studies. In also like in the space of the academy, and I guess it was mentioned, but kind of outside of it in terms of solidarity. But I guess to keep it a little more contained, why is this academic space important to house those, or how does it allow for that kind of solidarity work?
Big question. It's actually a double-edged sword. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think I can only speak for the particular institutions I've been at. I went to graduate school at Berkeley, and when I started at Berkeley, Asian American Studies was just kind of coming up. And you know, when I entered graduate school, I thought I was going to work on William Faulkner. That's what I wrote. And then I had a cohort of friends. We were doing Asian American sort of on the side with a reading group. And then it sort of was a period, and Elena's at Berkeley now. So there's a whole history, of course, of the East Coast. And we know the Asian American Studies movement, heavily influenced by the Black political movements. But you could see, of course, there's this whole narrative of Asian American studies originally being based in the community and then moving into the academy and becoming institutionalized. And it's always tough because I think so for example, at Berkeley, I wrote my dissertation on Asian American poetry. It then became my book. But I've been at the last 16 and a half years, I've been at Williams College, an elite liberal arts college in New England, and it hasn't had Asian American studies. You know, their students were fighting for it for over 35 years. So it was always seen as like a student activism thing. It's like an identity thing for them. But there was such resistance, right? And then oddly, I don't know, but oddly, it was various reasons. And I think a lot of it had to do with the visibility of the anti-Asian hatred and the violence, that all of a sudden these Asian American jobs started popping up everywhere last year, right? And at Williams, the faculty just voted last month, you know, to okay a concentration, which will lead to a program. But you know, but of course, African American Studies, which is now Africana, was a program long before that, and Latinx also. but you know, there's always this struggle because people at the grassroots level are fighting for Asian American studies for so long, and you're pushing and pushing. It's so difficult. But then when it becomes institutionalized, it becomes part of the institution. And that's the really, and I am not naive enough not to know that, you know, you can push and struggle and do activism, and then when it becomes part of the institution, it becomes something else, right? So, but on the other hand, I'm very aware from talking to students, they want the visibility of a program. So Asian American students really felt that they were disadvantaged at Williams because other students had the legitimizing factor of a program and faculty in a program that would fight for them for like prizes, you know, like award committee, you know, all kinds of things that people judge when they're at a small place. And so there is always that, and it's the same with Asian American studies as a field, that on the one hand, for many reasons, we could say, well, you know, do we really want this field? But if you don't have the field, unfortunately, who's going to teach this literature? It will have no visibility, right? So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, like none of us wants this kind of idea of like this essentializing thing, this kind of, you know, more fixed idea of what Asian American is. But I'm just really practical on the reality on the ground level. Who's going to hire Asian American professors or whatever, or teach the books, teach the interesting poetry like Margaret's who's going to read like it. And it's not, you know, it's just a very tough issue because the reality of one's life, you know, in an academic institution or as an artist or as a writer is you're very dependent on all these sort of vectors of power. And at the same time, one understands immediately that when something is institutionalized, it's taken up by the institution, right? So I don't know if Alain and Joan want to say anything.
Alain, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I don't know that much to say, yeah, I think it's exactly that. If you don't have those departments, then they don't get taught. Like, you know, I'm in an art department, and you know, we have, out of 8 faculty, we have you know, 3 who are Asian American, which is incredibly, we might be the only department in the country with that particular demographic. And, you know, I was chair for 6 years and also was able to make some shifts in the department to actually have to shift the curriculum. But without people in those kinds of positions, exactly what Dorothy said, these works don't get taught. You know, so then you actually need a department which also lets the universities off the hook, because then it can say, well, that's where it gets taught. We don't have to make changes within the English department, within the art department, you know, comparative lit and so on.
I mean, I guess I was thinking about a museum standpoint too, is that, you know, the one driver that will really change things is to have more Asian American donors, collectors, trustees. That will change that, because at that level, then the policy will change. Then there'll be a remit of, oh, we need to buy more Asian American art, right? We need to have positions for Asian American curators and so forth. But without that, it's very difficult to affect any kind of lasting or meaningful institutional change. But then at the same point, you know, at the same time, Alain and Dorothy, you both point out, is institutionalization really should that really be the end goal? Again, you know, because then what you start to have are these very sort of crystallized histories of Asian American art. I mean, for me, I'm really tired of the same kinds of histories that begin with, again, Chinese railroad workers, internment, Vietnam War, LA riots, and it's just recycled over and over again to the point where there starts to be a complete misalignment to the works that are actually made and fleshed out versus what it is that certain institutionalized viewpoints mandate, that these are sort of the flashpoints for an entire polity. And you know, for me, I'm kind of on both sides of the fence. I would love to see more Asian American artists and artworks and exhibitions, say in the museum context, but at the same time, at what cost?
Thank you so much. Those were incredible answers. And again, we're just so immensely grateful to have had you all here on the NSE today. Thank you for such a generous and rich conversation. There's so much to keep thinking about. we do have a tradition here at the Rail of closing our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Margaret Rhee, to the stage. Margaret Rhee is a poet, scholar, and media artist. Her debut poetry collection, Love, Robot, was published in 2017 and has received multiple awards, including the 2019 Best Book Award in Poetry by the Asian American Studies Association. Forthcoming books include The Watermelon Woman and Poetry Machines. Rhee is an assistant professor at the New School and in the School of Media Studies, and teaches in the Creative Writing MFA. Thank you so much, Margaret, for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor and Chloe and everyone at Brooklyn Rail. And I want to also thank Dorothy, Alan, and Joan for the conversation. It's been just such a rich, generative conversation. And in particular, Dorothy's work has been so impactful for poets of color and Asian American poets. So it's so meaningful to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and read two very short poems and one slightly longer poem. The first poem is written in solidarity with Black Lives Matters. It's entitled Theft of Color. When I ask, the histologist responds, cells have no color. We use ink to color the slides. In my understanding, my ultrasound was all light and some gray. My child grew to be made of dinosaur sounds, toothy kindness, and no particular color. I consider it theft when I have to teach my child how to answer, what are you and where are you from? Theft when he learns the futility of two hands raised in surrender. Ink bleeds through our ability to see, our sanction to breathe. This next poem is from my book, Love, Robot, which is a science fictional collection of poems of robots and humans falling in and out of love. And while there really isn't anything overtly Asian American in it, I like to think it's about identity and queerness and marginality. But I have one very short 4-line poem that includes race in it. So I'll read this one next. It's entitled Trace. Race is not programmed yet. So as you trace around my eyes, my lips, the round contours of my face, you say you are so human, all human. And the last poem I'll read was published in Amerasia Journal. It's a journal at UCLA that publishes Asian American Studies, Scholarship, and Literature. And it was in response to a case in 2015 where a white poet, Michael Derrick Hudson, was publishing poems under an Asian name. So this poem is entitled What We Write, What We Believe, an Asian American Poets Manifesto. And it's after the Third World Gay Revolution Manifesto published in 1972. And so I'll end with this one. 1, we want the right to self-determination for all Asian Americans and poets, as well as control of our destinies of our communities. We believe that Asian Americans and poets cannot be free until we are able to determine our own destinies, poetics, and names. 2, we want liberation for all women and their right to enjambments at any place, any time. 3, we want truthful teaching of American literature. 4, we can guarantee full equal publication for Asian American poets and all poets of color. 5, we demand all poets must read Langston Hughes as a primer. 6, only a white man could write, I celebrate myself for pages. We love Walt Whitman, but still, though, please keep this in mind. 7, we want reparations for all the Asian American poets who have experienced racism in poetry workshops. 8, we want the abolition of the academic industrial complex and to abolish the idea that politics is not poetics. 10, we want to end to the fascist poets who utilize aesthetics for racist purposes, an end to their access to Microsoft Word, pink paper, pink suits, glibness, and gel pens. 11, we want all Asian American poets to be exempt from tokenization, be it an anthology, committee, press, or marriage. 12, we demand all allies to step up closer to commit to actual structural practices that open up poetry to diversity. This means actively fostering Asian American poetry as a viable literature with a future in history. 13, we believe in the spectacular. See Joseph O. Legoski on the future of Asian American poetry. 14, we want a new society and a new poetics, a revolutionary one. Free food, free poetry, free books, free pencils, free love, free art for all. We want a poetry society where the needs of the most oppressed poets are first, not just white poets. 15, we want to demand the politics of poetry is not simply on the page or the stage or Twitter, but the organized movement for change. See Undocu Poets. 16, we want to end to all banned literature, ethnic literature. We want to insist on ethnic pulp served as sustenance. 17, we believe there's nothing inherently just about poetry, but in the hands of wrongdoers, it can go terribly and we need to leave from the poetry reading. 18, my skin is my own shade of yellow. You can't take what belongs to me. 19, what it means to be human, the soft moan of recognition at the breath of a line, how she began crying after reading Li Young Lee for the first time in her college library. 20, consider the history of yellow. 21, consider the history of your hand. 22, if it only was as easy as taking on your name. 23, maybe then you'll get it now. 24, the cars are driving fast on the highway. 25, how two poets reclaimed a love song called Kundiman. This is what we believe. 26, she picks up her pen. 27, she calls it out. 28, she writes one word. 29, take me near. 30, take me closer. 31, Rhapsody in plain yellow. 32, John Donne, are you listening? 33, remember poets daydream. 34, remember we danced. 35, remember you believed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was an absolutely beautiful, precious reading and really just perfect to close the amazing conversation we had today. A huge, huge thanks again to Dorothy, Alan, and Joan. Thanks again, Margaret, for the great reading. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And thanks to the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Loie Hollowell, Harminder Judge, and Jason Rosenfeld on the occasion of Love Letter at Pace Gallery. We will conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Leah Dworkin. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you head out into the rest of your day. Thank you all again.
Thank you. Have a
Amazing.
good day.
Thank you. Thanks for the great
Thank you
conversation.
so much.
Well,
That was
thanks,
incredible.
everybody.
Thanks, Margaret, for the poetry.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you again.